I was surprised it was left out, actually, because it's an important point. Are there any other questions?
Is there, is there a record of his teachings while he was in Kashmir?
So there are little bits. So one thing about this is that we don't have like, detailed documents, like detailed books written on this exact topic that are 2,000 years old. So what you will have is sort of inscriptions, references from different areas that kind of mention him and talk about him, with the odd one here, the odd one there. And a lot of the things, a lot of the material that is present now is sort of dated to the 16th, 17th century, not 2,000 years ago, but more modern. But there are references about his, in terms of his teaching. So there is things that talk about like the parable of the sower, and there are other kind of core teachings about what he actually taught. And I can guess where your question is going is, how different was his teaching to what he kind of taught there? I don't think there's anything that kind of, I think the viewpoint possessed there is more of Jesus as someone who was trying to get everyone to back to the core teaching what Judaism taught, rather than viewing himself as sort of a son of God type figure. So I think the references we do see are more of a kind of moral type teaching that is less kind of a new faith and more around kind of emphasizing the peace and the love aspects of Judaism.
So you didn't try and set up a new church?
No, correct, yeah.
Yeah, so if Jesus did recover from crucifixion and appeared to his disciples, then left for India, how come he left his disciples believing all these things, like he rose from the dead?
So there's there's a good point, two ways of looking at it. Some people I've heard say that, look, Jesus' life, he wasn't safe where he was at the time. And some have almost said that the resurrection was almost like a cover story to allow him to basically depart and his life not be in danger. But what I want to highlight instead is, who were the authors of the four Gospels, right, was the first question. So it was mentioned on the film as well that we're not really sure who authored them, but also in terms of those particular Gospel authors, how close were they to Jesus, right? And the reason I would question that is because at the time of his crucifixion, and if we go with the story we believe in around his survival, etc., like the disciples basically flee. And the people who gain access to Jesus' body, which I would have thought would be one of the most crucial things, right? You'd be the closest people to him, are actually Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. Like, now, who are those guys, right? It's a question. The Gospel refers to them as secret disciples. So it's almost as if, so it's like, hang on a minute, so the moment where he's, in his moment of need, the disciples we're referring to are not on the scene, but these other secret disciples are. So who are they? Is there something else going on? Who are the ones who are really closest to Jesus, who are really involved in, trying to help and save him? And if we forward the story on, the fact that Joseph of Arimathea owned a tomb very close to where the crucifixion all took place, kind of sort of points towards some kind of planning that must have gone on here. And the fact that he had access, he took the body, etc., and was able to revive him, suggests, or may suggest, that there was some almost inside group that was closer to Jesus perhaps than what the Gospel authors were, that were kind of orchestrating or arranging for this. But it's all open to interpretation as well in terms of what the disciples really believed, what Jesus disclosed to them, and whether is it that they were trying to not narrate that piece, or is it that he just didn't say that to them, but this is where I'm going to go, and this is just something he went and did.
Is there any evidence of early Christian groups who didn't believe it? For example, we know this, the Pauline, as it were, community, Peter and Paul. Are there any others that differed on that point? Because it did mention early Christian communities which had different views. So, do you know anything about that?
From what I know, not that we're in Jerusalem, so I don't think I've seen Christian groups that are based in that area or that are now based there that kind of will have this. I don't think you would see, you don't tend to hear this particular viewpoint by any kind of Christian.
No, I mean then, in the first century.
So how would we know? So basically, are there any texts?
Were there any communities? I'm specifically thinking of St. James, for example, and the Ebionites, who very much were against the Pauline version of the death and the resurrection, so on and so forth. I don't know what he wrote, but I've heard that he was very much an opponent of St. Paul. And was that reflected in the theological differences as well?
So I know the Ebionites' viewpoint on Jesus is quite close to the Islamic viewpoint now, in terms of mortal human being and not someone who was miraculous. But whether I haven't seen anything about them saying he survived the crucifixion.
Okay. Right.
Do Ahmadi Muslims have a viewpoint on whether Jesus was trained as a Dalai Lama?
So
Or is that because that was mentioned in the
yeah, no, good point.
maybe he travelled
It is
there
mentioned.
early on
Yeah.
in his life.
Yeah. So I think at the time, so Ahmadi Muslims would say, and it's mentioned, there's a reference to it in here, and it's basically, so this, the author, founder of our community, was obviously in India when he was writing this, and there were particularly some strong Hindu groups at the time that were involved in a lot of preaching activity, and this was one angle they took actually, was to say Jesus was actually trained by us. We taught him everything, so this Christianity origins and so around. Ahmadi viewpoint, and mentioned in there, is that that's not what took place. But see, there's different. Yeah, there was a scroll referred to there about, So one question is, where was Jesus between the ages of 12 and 30? That question is still an open question. There's no references in the Bible about what he did during that time. And the other documentary I mentioned, called Jesus in India, takes that particular question as its main question. Where was he between 12 and 30? Did he go to India? Did he study there? So Ahmadi viewpoint would be no, he didn't study there, and he didn't travel in his youth. But there are some reference documents that suggest maybe he may have done. But what I find interesting is if you read the documents that talk about, there is one specific document, a scroll, called The Life of Saint Isa. If you read that, it doesn't actually read as Jesus learning from them. The way it works is, the way it narrates is that he would spend 6 or so years, would say the Zoroastrians is mentioned explicitly, learning their scriptures, understanding it, but then he not turns on them, but there comes a stage where he tells them, this is what is correct in your belief and this is what is incorrect. And he gives a very monotheistic viewpoint and teaching. And when, there's still many questions about whether that scroll is authentic or not, but when you read that, it kind of sounds very similar to kind of a more traditional Jesus approach kind of thing. And it's same with the Hindus, it has him attacking the caste system and some of these other things. Now, I'm not saying that document is accurate, but if it is, it doesn't really show Jesus as absorbing the teachings, say, of Buddha or being trained as a Lama and then preaching that. It's more about him learning what they had to offer as well and then saying this is what you should be learning. So it's more of a gathering some knowledge rather than a we created you type thing. But it's an open question, and it's an area some books are focused just on that piece. It's probably a bit less controversial from 12 to 13 to work out where he was, what he studied.
So the viewpoint would be that he wasn't necessarily trained by those people,
Yeah.
but he may well have travelled there and been exposed to...
I have to be very careful. So the Ahmadi viewpoint is very much that he didn't travel at all.
Why is that?
Well, it isn't entirely.
I can read you a
I know the
clear
quotation
quote.
off my heart, but
It's a pretty clear quote. So
the question to be asked also is with respect to the early travels, I would say, on your point, is that why would anybody even pay attention to a 13 to 14-year-old travelling in the East? Nobody would even bother recording it.
right.
So that's also a question to be asked as to whether the score is valid.
Where was right. See what you're saying. But then the scroll starts or was written in response to the fact that they had heard of the crucifixion. So they start saying they've just put to death, the just Saint Isa, and this is who he was, and this is where he travelled and studied. So it's a tantalising document because it seems to it fills the gap perfectly, and it gives a kind of a plausible explanation. But I guess the jury's still out. And from an Ahmadi viewpoint, it's not one of the it's not something Ahmadis specifically believe in. But for me personally, I find it interesting and a possibility.
Any more questions?
Just had a question in the same area.
You can tell us what was told in French. You can tell us what was subtitled in
Yeah,
French.
I can. Do the Buddhist monks keep a record of the children they train as Dalai Lamas? Because there are many films about it, and it seems to be very accurate.
Yeah. So Buddhists were great authors of history and chroniclers of it. It was a massive tradition for them to write every single thing
That's
down.
why I wonder.
Yeah, and for them 1,000 years is not a long time because they believe in that sort of reincarnation, etc. So they would document everything. but trying to get access to what they've written is where you have the issue. So there's the film I mentioned, Jesus in India. In there, the presenter of the film tries to go to these Buddhist monasteries and gain access to it, and he's told that the only person who can open this crate and allow you access to these scrolls is our Dalai, a particular Lama, and he kind of left when he was young, and he might be back, but we don't know. But when he comes back, then we'll open it. Until then, they're locked up. So, and there's every time a researcher has gone there to try and find this one specific document, St. Easter Scroll, they've come across these issues. Some of them have had it narrated to them and they've written it and translated it. Others have gone more recently and been told there is no such scroll. And I think the last time a documentary was done on that topic, they contacted the Dalai Lama to say, is this true or not? Yeah, surely you own these monasteries. I think he gave a very kind of non-committal answer, like I've heard about this as well. But
like the fish swims upstream and does not encounter the scroll or something.
Actually, I have no idea what you're talking about.
No.
But yeah, they've got close to getting this scroll, but not quite. So I know one lady is writing, an American-based Sikh author is writing a book just on this one specific scroll, which is the one that talks about Jesus traveling in his youth. But again, I don't know if I think trying to get access to that actual scroll is something that a lot of people are trying to do, but it's just not being able to achieve it. But yeah, Buddhists probably, they wrote everything down. Yeah. Yeah.
I think we're going to, if there are no more questions, sorry.
With Buddhism, if Jesus went over to India, what was the effect that he had on the Buddhist people?
So there is a lot of questions from you guys because I know what you're trying to get at. So there is. I know what you're getting at because I know him, and I didn't plow him. Yeah, I suppose you're referring to there was a prophecy for a Maitreya Buddha, which was like a white, fair-skinned kind of Buddha. So I think there was, at the time of Buddha, which we think was about 500 years before Jesus, there was a prophecy in their scripture that there will come a white kind of white Messiah in a way, in one translation, but some kind of figure who would come and reform Buddhism or help Buddhism. And some scholars from the Buddhist angle have said that Jesus physically presided over the fourth Buddhist council, which was supposed to have taken place around India and around the time he was supposed to have been there. So remind us that what you were referencing. Okay, so that's another viewpoint that he had some impact on Buddhism as a faith as well. So yeah, also just to mention as well. So I think aside from I was going to say aside from whether it's true or not. In addition to whether it's true or not, this does actually present quite a positive image of Jesus as well. So we're saying that if you take the Jewish viewpoint, if you like, is that this failed Messiah was put to death and executed, and that ended the story. We don't believe in the resurrection because someone stole the body probably when we didn't see it. But if we can say that, actually no, you didn't crucify him, you weren't able to bring about his death, and in fact God saved him and he carried on his mission and he preached, and then if we also say he may have had a positive influence on other particular religions, you're presenting him as his life has even greater significance, arguably, because you're saying it wasn't just a 2 or 3 year ministry, it's a much longer period than that, and it touched thousands more people, tens of thousands more people than you know. So it's kind of it's quite a positive message as well.
So thank you very much for coming. I think we're going to close it there. There is some free literature at the front, both about the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, but also